Part 3, Solutions and Dangers. Chapter 8, An Overview in Action. Of all the global processes causing social instability, only some are unavoidable. Fortunately for us, the damage caused by the others can be limited, and that's the topic of this chapter. The tremors experienced by the West of late are primarily fed by two large-scale phenomena rocking the West's boat: waves of emigration and the pandemic. In 2020, Turkey re-enabled the flow of immigrants through Greece when the Greeks had had enough of what they felt was hypocrisy on the part of other European countries. The latter were refusing to bear the heavy burden of innumerable immigrants making their way through Greece onto the mainland. The Greeks quietly began deporting immigrants on boats back to the Aegean Sea and Turkey's border, in opposition to the European Human Rights Charter. The deportation policy didn't develop in a vacuum, but was promoted by the extreme right nationalistic The Golden Dawn Party, whose platform was founded on the struggle against immigration into Greece. Whether such a policy is justified from the Greek viewpoint or not is irrelevant now to the current discussion. Rather, the policy demonstrated how politicians and policy setters want to recruit support from as broad a population as possible, even if the path to that goal doesn't always comport with their beliefs. The easiest way to achieve the goal is to play on people's emotions, in this case, the Greek nationalistic emotions, which politicians identified as particularly sensitive. Similarly, the political left leverages public emotion for political power, and of late, public emotion centered around the injustice of social inequality. The left does this through identity politics, which emphasizes countless areas of inequality, followed by presenting the left's ideas as the way to save the situation. Politics is the art of acquiring, holding, and wielding power, said Indira Gandhi, India's former prime minister and leader of the populist Indian left. Gandhi was murdered by her bodyguards, who belonged to an ethnic group that opposed the PM after she sent soldiers to storm its temple. Gandhi understood perfectly how to take maximum advantage of the political rift in order to boost her own party until it cost her her life. America's Democrats talk a great deal about race. That so many individuals are engaged in this subject can perhaps derive from a moral or personal interest, but it is also a political strategy. Blacks make up some 14% of the American population, and causing them to feel like a pursued minority is simply the easiest way to gain voters. That's why there'll always be politicians who'll choose this approach. The only question is, how low will they go in order to garner supporters? And what drives the feeling lately that there's just no bottom to the barrel? A long tail, tribal bonfires, and disgusting politics. Let's spend a bit more time on this important point. Why is it impossible to educate a generation of politicians not to use tactics that polarize society? In retrospect, everyone wants a cohesive society. Nonetheless, politicians excel at marking the other and blaming the other for all deficiencies that can gain any applause. Some politicians owe their popularity solely to their hawkish opposition to the right wing or to the left, and vice versa. Too sadly, even though we'd expect this phenomenon to tone down in this age of free and easy communication, its exacerbation has spread worldwide. The USA, of course, is leading the trend. From the political right, the populist President Trump positioned a previously almost non-existent confrontation between Americans and Hispanics front and center stage with regard to the border wall separating the USA from Mexico. On the left, Obama, the knight of identity politics, whipped racial identity and stances relating to race into political power. A range of studies proves that during his presidency, the disparity between views held by blacks and whites grew massively. What causes politicians to take advantage of and empower social rifts intended to strengthen their positions? We find a window shedding light on this new dynamic in 2004, coming in the form of an economic marketing insight. Chris Anderson, editor of a technology magazine, noticed that some 75% of Amazon's income actually derived from sales of unpopular books, the kind that are impossible to get hold of in regular bookstores, and which are generally stored in limited quantities. As one Amazon employee said, "Today we sold more books that weren't sold yesterday than all the books we sold yesterday and today together." The same phenomenon has set in with Netflix, which during the same period rented out some 55,000 titles for DVD films. Anderson found that about 80% of Netflix's income came from renting films which aren't in regular video libraries, such as documentaries and Bollywood movies. The same story came to light with Rhapsody, the first to allow its subscribers to hear songs through internet data streaming services. The company's manager was surprised that there were no songs with zero demand, and even a song ranked in 400,000th place as far as popularity was ordered at least once a month. That's why there was no logic at all in filtering songs coming into the database. Every song lodged was welcomed. Anderson continued researching, finding more and more examples of the same phenomenon. It turned out that Google's income is sourced equally in advertising for small businesses, such as haberdashery shops or hairdressers, as it is in advertising from large-scale companies. Penny to penny, coin to coin, slowly but surely I'll make $1 million. Rumpelstiltskin. The internet has significantly changed commerce by reducing distribution and storage expenses to zero. In this social network era, electronic books are easily stored, music and advertising materials can be stored in unlimited quantities on a digital farm any distance away, and items can be put on show with digital-only displays. These conditions undermine the concept of box office hits to the degree that they're almost valueless. The range of preferences shown by the public has dramatically expanded and is less focused on popularity, whereas previously, preferences were dictated by those in the know. It brings to mind that until the 1970s, mainstream TV shows excluded black musicians. The new phenomenon is neatly described in illustration 32. On the horizontal axis, we see the items being offered for sale. Popular items are located on the left, and the unpopular items on the far right, from the box office hit Wonder Woman all the way to Tommy Wiseau's film The Room, from successful Google ads to ads with countless spelling errors, from Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love to the Bulgarian music idol auditioner Valentina Hassan singing Ken Lee, a hopeful phonetic version of Mariah Carey's Can't Live Without You. By the way, if you are not familiar with Wiseau's The Room, take note that it is considered the worst film of all time, with a total income of $1,800, but a production cost of $6 million. I watched it, and I can indeed say it's got an amazing array of the worst possible actors, a talentless director and producer without even the most minimal knowledge, and the editing level of a 7-year-old. I warmly recommend it, especially with a sip of whiskey or any other consciousness-dulling substance. Dichotomy. If that's how things work, then statements of civil irresponsibility made by politicians enjoy a digital distribution system that can translate itself into electoral power on voting day. Along the way, inequality of outcome and the disparity among groups become even more pronounced, encouraging social polarization. When sufficiently strong, social polarization also turns into an economic engine. For example, right before I started writing this section, I checked websites identified clearly with the left or the right, and within 5 minutes had collected 20 examples of polarizing statements, such as the Lincoln Project roasts GOP for betraying American values, left loves censorship because it's all they have, U.S. newspapers, High Court the controlling narcissist cult, or the right-wingers anarchists, Israeli newspapers, lie, deny, and move on. How much longer will the Johnson mantra plague British politics? The left seems to hate Britain, yet thinks it's fine for migrants, UK newspapers. Polarization means taking an uncompromising stance against something, irrespective of what that thing is, against liberals, against the European Union, against Trump, or against immigrants. The shared dangerous element here is the degree of uncompromising insistence. A recent study reviewing 9 democracies from 1975 to 2017 examined public feeling towards various political parties. In 4 democracies, the USA, Canada, New Zealand, and Switzerland, factionalism increased, but not on the basis of ideology. Researchers identified polarization that focused less on ideas and ideologies and more on outbursts against the abominable supporters of the opposition party. One result of polarization is the loss of trust in governmental institutions and the democratic concept. According to the Democracy Perception Index, which is published annually and reviews 124,000 individuals across the world, 40% of the citizens in surveyed democracies in 2020 felt that their country wasn't really a democracy. They explain their stance with the claim that their governments are serving the interests of powerful groups. In case you wondered, some 49% of Americans felt that the US did uphold democratic principles, while for most European countries, the numbers were a bit higher. Let's examine the American political discourse closely. Note how the debate about social stability and democracy is ironically circular in nature. Interestingly, other countries share very similar controversies. In the table below, I've summarized the essential right-left electoral disputes as of 2020. To the listeners, the next illustration is a bit hard to convey. It is a table that summarizes the political discourse controversy in the US in 2022. Those who want a deeper understanding should take a look at the hard copy. Amongst the claims, conservatives, non-citizen voting, urban machine politics, and fake claims undermine democracy. In the age of mass immigration, this becomes a realistic fear. Liberals, democracy should be in favor of letting as many people vote as possible. The conservative anxieties about low information voters are non-realistic. But on the other hand, conservatives also claim that liberalism stands too much for elite power, which is anti-democratic. The people should get to decide. This is democracy. Banning the people's voices is undemocratic. And liberals say experts should lead professional decision-making. We can't have a fake news-informed mob playing politics with complex matters. Note that the important conclusions in bold text are similar for both sides of the divide, and only the identities of the guilty parties, so to speak, are different. In the end, as Julius Caesar said, in most cases men are quick to believe that which they wish to be true. Most Americans identify with a column in this table and generally stick to it. Each country has its own table. Draw your own and look at it. It's hard to accept that, though. You must surely identify with at least one stance in the opposing set of views, which is quite justified. So think better. Think again. The situation we learned to recognize in Chapter 7, where Democrats and Republicans view each other as existential threats, is a risk because the discourse on current issues becomes warped. Every topic, whether about social issues, security, health, internal policy, or climate change, becomes framed as a simple argument between Democrat and Republican stances, as though every problem in public policy can have only two approaches. And that's usually just not true. Why does this happen in the USA? The problem is the American election method, where the winner takes it all. People tend to forego voting for a small party, knowing that small parties basically don't stand a chance, which in practical terms means their vote would simply be wasted. Political science teaches that this process leads to Duverger's law, according to which in election systems of this kind, two parties will always eventuate. A second and no less ridiculous outcome is that in actuality, there's almost no difference between the policies presented by the two parties, simply because electorally there's no need for them. People are interested in the principles of a party's stances, for instance, owning guns, abortion, and so on, rather than its actual policy. This analysis, which finds only ostensible differences, is the view held by most serious commentators in the USA. The necessary conclusion is that there's no reason to think so dichotomously about the American left and the American right. Think about how many negative statements were made about Trump's personality rather than his policies. Research on an analysis of voting data in the USA published in 2020 confirmed the obvious. People living near cities traditionally vote for the political left. Rural areas traditionally vote for the right. See illustration 34. The researchers found that this result is not dependent on education, religion, religious devotion, or family structure. This dizzying fact derives from differences in the structure of social life in cities compared to rural areas. The latter place far more importance on community, whereas city dwellers tend to rely more on themselves and therefore have far less need of unifying narratives. The wish to align with the population in the region where you live creates a voting bubble, a phenomenon common worldwide. As consumers of news, we take in the information we want to hear. which makes us a victim of the shelling model explored in depth in Chapter 1. If you use social media, there's a good chance that you're in a digital echo chamber operating at double the impact. And it's also feasible that you'll become even more extreme. If you've somehow avoided being in an online political echo chamber because you're aware of the problems involved and therefore actively work to counter that, you've still got a problem. Why? Because it's reasonable to presume that in one way or another, you're affected by the naming game. And perhaps your independent and firm opinion is actually the outcome of influence wielded by small, obstinate groups. As I write these lines, hundreds of sworn Trump supporters entered Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., taking control of the old hall for several hours. A large proportion of Americans believe Trump is directly responsible for this event, but he's not the only one. The entire system discussed in this book brought about a state where people are so inflamed by their own truth that the voice of Trump, who still refuses to acknowledge the outcome to this day, keeps reverberating in his supporters' minds. In Israel, by contrast, things are somewhat more complex since our population is segmented around several disputes. On one hand, closed social structures in certain groups in Israel drive overwhelming agreement among their members that the government is out to get them. And these groups may adopt actions such as civil rebellion. On the other hand, because these groups have very limited power, the probability of a real rebellion is very low. Other political groups in Israel are also polarized to the degree that the fear of a real uprising driven by one of them is very real. It seems that we're marching along a route with only one outcome, the undermining of our social and political stability. If we explore all the processes summarized in illustration 18, it is easy to think that almost all of them are unavoidable. Nonetheless, there's hope. There are three factors we can use to drive change, and we're going to talk about two of them now. The third will get its due in Chapter 10. The first is political bias in conventional communication, and the second is the social network's interest maps, moderating the impact of media bias. Some years ago, I habitually read Hürriyet, the English version of the Turkish Daily. It was interesting because some of the reporters consistently had fun at Erdogan's expense, whereas others worshipped him. But with the attempted 2016 revolution, criticism completely disappeared, as did some of the reporters. The newspaper became one great song of praise for Erdogan. From his perspective, Erdogan is right. Look at illustration 28 again. A significant reduction in sources of information is more effective than increasing censorship scope. But that solution is not acceptable to some 80% of the global population, and I'm among them. Somewhat more complex solutions are clearly needed. As Chomsky and Herman showed, media bias is not so easy to erase. There's a web of interests and strong rivalry among news editors, financiers, and citizens when it comes to political power. In general, it's unclear whether a reporter's subjective viewpoint should be removed because the very essence of their reporting contains a personal element and not just an aspiration to garner the truth. As such, this personal viewpoint can help drive civil participation. Clear water has no fish. The ancient Chinese philosopher Hong Zicheng tells us, there's also something to be gained from unclear complex situations, or, in our case, from a field with countless personal interests. Erasing all bias is impossible, we realize, but perhaps it can be reduced somewhat when society begins to display instability. The ideal solution in this case would be for media to adopt a middle road, such as portals that concentrate news items from several sources with a tag indicating each one's political tendency, as shown in illustration 35. This type of portal would win over a very significant audience, probably in the range of millions of daily viewers, though not as large as the viewership of politically identified newsrooms such as CNBC with its 140 million daily views. But a portal of this kind would allow people to access news while being aware of the site's inbuilt political bias, which would arouse a more critical approach. The power of the free market would determine in the end whether such sites can establish a more dominant audience, but governmental support for the concept would surely assist. Reducing the media market by closing down left-biased or right-biased newspapers as an outcome of market forces is not a goal to aim for. Those with the money and the power directly and indirectly control the media. The more media outlets there are, the more complex it becomes to oversee them, which in fact is a far more preferable status for all of us. Two researchers from Stanford and Oxford developed a model demonstrating exactly this. They provided mathematical proof to show how multiple media outlets make things very tough on the relationship between media organizations and government institutions, providing some measure of protection against corruption. It's not a stretch to see how this works, because when it comes to the huge number of players in the media field, the scope of investment needed to prevent a specific news item's publication costs more than silencing it is worth. After all, can the interest holder be guaranteed that some unknown blogger won't pop up and publicize the very acts that the interest holder wishes to conceal? And bloggers, as we know, pop up like mushrooms after rain. The necessary conclusion, then, is that it's better for a country to allow as many media outlets to operate as possible. If we want to moderate media's influence, we need to promote a law requiring every outlet to carry a diagram of the kind shown in illustration 21 on every masthead, printed or electronic, clearly indicating the outlet's position on the diagram. This would let readers immediately understand the outlet's political bias and the balance between fact and subjective viewpoint presented in that outlet. Yes, it's highly probable that most readers are already aware of the large-scale outlet's political biases, but it's not quite as clear whether they're fully aware of the degree to which the outlet presents opinion as actual facts. Positioning the outlet on a graph would, of course, have economic significance, which raises questions such as, 1. Who determines where news sites should be positioned on the diagram? 2. What type of information should appear on the diagram? What I suggested above or something else? 3. What constitutes a newspaper? And would the same apply to people expressing their opinions? For now, let's deal just with the first central issue. Professional literature suggests several methods for positioning news outlets on the diagram, the simplest being through a periodic survey to update the data. The survey would present a large number of news items without stating their source, accompanied by a designated questionnaire. The literature proposes several methods for shaping efficient evaluation, but the idea behind these methods is to use emotion analysis programs within the specific text. The method would measure political bias based on the number of sentiments hidden in a specific text, or in the way the news outlet chooses to deal with political figures. The outcome would, on one hand, indicate news outlets trying to produce more balanced media in order not to be marked as presenting political biases, or at least operating under a clear, known framework of their political biases. On the other hand, readers would be able to activate the filter relevant to the news they wish to consume, moderating social networks' discourse. Oh, you might not have noticed, but according to all the indices we've looked at in the book, it turns out that more or less since 2008, the degree of polarization has risen sharply. Researchers note the global economic crisis that year as the turning point behind the change. Undoubtedly, the crisis is part of the issue. After all, we've seen how economic crises throughout history have led to civil unrest and rebellions. But years have passed since the 2008 economic crisis and the accompanying research, yet social instability is continuing to grow. 2008 could well be the turning point, but something more is happening. In 2006, Twitter's founder Jack Dorsey sent the first tweet into the world. Just setting up my Twitter, spelled that way purposely. From that moment on, the social network began growing. Several months later, Facebook opened up to everyone following years during which registration was open only to students of elite American universities. Simultaneously in the same year, the percentage of the public owning 3G cell phones worldwide rose sharply. 3G facilitated fast upload of images and clips and enabled users to surf the internet conveniently. Illustration 36 demonstrates what's happened since 2008. Let's keep in mind the Pew survey we've already discussed, showing that more than 2/3 of Americans consider social networks their primary source for news updates. We can only conclude that social networks constitute a significant component in social polarization and social instability. Social networks are undermining governmental stability worldwide, a fact most researchers agree on. In non-democratic countries, such as those in Africa, Asia, and South America, and the regime holds extensive options for reacting and controlling social networks. They have a quick hand on the internet shutdown switch. In 2019, when election results were disputed in the Democratic Republic of Congo and when ethnic conflicts and Ebola broke out, the regime decided to activate damage control and disconnect citizens from the internet. Despite its name, the republic is as far from being democratic as North is from South. Congo isn't alone. Mauritius and Ethiopia blocked internet access following disputed election outcomes. The Global Freedom on the Net is an annual country-by-country assessment by Freedom House, which shows that global internet freedom has been dropping consistently over the past decade. The organization's report lists 38 countries which established official institutions to shape internet awareness. These operate via the internet with the purpose of covertly promoting ideas which support the government. China did this well when it set up its GFW, the Great Firewall, which blocks Chinese internet users from accessing most Western social networks, including Google and Wikipedia. In addition, the penalty in China for sharing an item or reaction which the government doesn't approve of can lead to incarceration. In Russia, the Sovereign Internet Law of 2021 provides a legal basis for mass surveillance of internet traffic and allows the government to efficiently enforce online legislation. The law requires internet providers to install an audit system on their servers. DPI, or Deep Packet Inspection, allows the source of traffic to be identified. If not to the government's liking, the content can be filtered or blocked. So far, so good, but if the plans go ahead well, Russia will build its own internet network where social networks may find themselves censored to a greater degree, if not completely blocked. We'll look more into the nature of this technology later in the chapter. By contrast to the countries noted above, countries in the free world allow internet networks to operate subject to certain laws originally meant to protect the individual and society in the non-virtual world, but which have been adapted to the virtual world. In most free world countries, these laws are not suited to the particular arena they aim to cover, and primarily end up constituting a safe harbor for social media companies which prefer to avoid taking responsibility for the content they present. Take, for example, the Palestinian Quds group on Facebook, which promotes hate-filled clips such as reconstructions of Palestinians murdering a Jewish couple, the Henkins shot dead at short range by Hamas operatives right before their children's eyes, or an explanatory clip on how to optimally stab Jews. Another clip asks residents, "How would you kill a Jew or soldier?" And the responders provide various horrific descriptions. As these lines are being written, the group is still active in the name of freedom of expression. But we shouldn't wonder at that because megacorporations' interests don't correlate to the public interest, which eventually drives the creation of social initiatives like www.stophateforprofit.org, working to embed this understanding. We'll talk more about that later. Only recently has the free world seen an evident need for change. As I write these lines, India is drafting legislation aimed at regulating internet content in general and social network content in particular, as a way of fighting the fake news phenomenon. India's decisive approach is a reaction to events which began with the spread of a false claim that children were being traded for organ harvesting. Sent out on WhatsApp, the claim led to a wave of violence by rabble-rousers in more than 30 catastrophic cases of lynching. The primary thrust of these reforms will enable the Indian government access to the data collected by social networks on their users. The reforms will allow the Indian government to relatively easily locate sources of fake news, freely research big tech companies' databases vis-a-vis their processing of personal data on citizens, and activate means of punishment if the laws are not upheld. India's proposal includes laws protecting passwords, financial data, health data, sex life data, and sexual tendencies, biometric data, genetic data, and ethnic affiliation, a far broader starting position to that currently functioning in the Western world. Other than a 2019 amendment to the copyright law in Israel, which allows the removal of sites presenting stolen content, there is full internet freedom. The country has no legal mandate to instruct social networks on removing or blocking access to content. Israel, like France, Germany, Italy, and so many other countries, adopted the middle road in order to protect itself. Countries adopting this approach contact the internet megacorporations directly and ask them to remove problematic users, content, and accounts, especially if the problematic materials infringe on national security. The problem with social networks is that, for much of the public, they constitute a kind of passive notice board and nothing more. And who can accuse a notice board of anything? But when biased users go on Facebook, Zuckerberg rubs his palms together in glee because right after the user finishes sharing his views with the world, the spate of reactions, both left-wing and right-wing, spikes within seconds. And to Zuckerberg, that means money flowing in. Researchers from New York University prove that posts containing words which describe emotions or moral values, especially hate, shame, and greed, will likely go viral. In other words, a simple program which tracks these words and increases the exposure of posts containing them will be sufficient to cause big cash flows into the social network. Nonetheless, everybody's views have a place and are important to the discourse. So from this book's perspective, it wouldn't be appropriate, and certainly not democratic, to entirely exclude the biased user from social networks. After all, freedom of speech is the fulcrum of democracy and the engine driving ideas and innovations. What could perhaps be done is to limit the amount of publicity that certain politically identified persons can access. In light of what we've learned, we could formulate some rules of thumb that are worth anchoring in the laws of a country as a means to mitigate the dynamic that promotes social polarization on social networks. Networks themselves operate similar independent audit systems. But as we've said, those are subject to financial considerations and have no external supervision. In the current situation, surfers can find themselves excluded from the network without having a clue as to why. The rules suggested here need thorough and ongoing examination while being implemented and streamlined based on their success, but their implementation needs little more than simple AI tools. 1. Freedom of speech must not be limited as long as the content complies with the rules regarding criminal law. However, when a text arouses multiple violent reactions which drive social polarization, a threshold must be set for the number of violent responses, and any text passing the threshold will be removed. A similar policy is already being implemented by social networks themselves concerning the publication of pornographic materials. 2. The account of this type of text's author or spreader will be suspended for a specific period if the event recurs and following an appropriate warning. Again, a similar policy is being applied by these social networks in all areas relating to pornography. Number 3, the site will be responsible for identifying frequent spreaders of fake news and removing them. Research shows that 0.1% of surfers spread 80% of the fake news. 4. Social networks will be report on algorithm changes based on government requirements and will enable satisfactory access to academic researchers and government reviewers. We'll relate to the importance of this point in the next chapter. These rules are key because they place a degree of legal responsibility on the networks for what's happening in their arena, and therefore open them to lawsuits. In the next chapter, we'll show to what extent legal responsibility constitutes an obstacle to applying the rules. But for now, we'll note that the rules aren't highly specific, and that is because social networks are so dynamic, the rules will very quickly become invalid. If there is a productive discourse and an effective continuous struggle against the problems caused by social networks, it isn't enough to subordinate their activities to the lazy mechanism of laws made by the political echelon. Legislators worldwide tend to lack even the most minimal technological training. By way of example, 1 physicist and 3 engineers were serving in Israel's 20th parliament, but only one, Ayelet Shaked, was a computer engineer. In the 2020 French National Assembly, of 577 House members, only some 20 were engineers and scientists, and of those, only 1 was linked to computer science. The same is true for most countries. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg has been invited several times over the years to American Congress hearings, during which it became embarrassingly apparent that even the investigating committee's members were ignoramuses on all matters relating to applied technology on the internet and social networks. Look at this sample exchange from 2018. Senator Orrin Hatch: "If surfers don't pay, how do you profit?" Mark Zuckerberg, in evident shock: "Senator, we profit from advertising. An expert is needed." Clearly, there's no alternative. Every country needs an independent and professional administration, which, for the purpose of our discussion, we'll call the Digital Authority. A tiny administration of this nature was actually set up in the USA in 2001 to supervise Microsoft. For some 20 years, Microsoft provided the authority with ongoing data and algorithms as requested. But for such an authority to succeed, it needs to be provided with the appropriate scope of independence and entitlement to take action that will prevent, as far as possible, splitting areas of authority between the digital wing and other wings of government. When authority is split, it enables the networks once again to hide in the thicket of bureaucracy. The digital authority's structure should allow it to operate with maximum detachment from the influence of both internet giants and politics. That's a major obstacle because it is really hard to form an institution of that kind. It's a ripe target for all the problems lurking in wait for such organizations. Lengthy tenures vital for any professional organization, as we see with legal systems, and the process of filling the positions, which may be open to unwanted influences, as they often are in academia, for example. It's therefore worthwhile that the individuals filling those positions should, on one hand, have solid power within the system, but on the other hand, their tenure should be limited to one round, which is not for too long. Because the bulk of voters and politicians lack the necessary knowledge and time to evaluate the needs of such an authority, its boundaries of activity must be very clearly defined, and it must be protected from frequent changes at the political level. Auditing the behavior of social networks requires the law to allow the authority to access these companies' databases. Initially, the authority's purpose would be to oversee the use of databases and algorithms, primarily by opening them up to external audit and research. Such a policy would also prepare public opinion for further regulation if required. If we want to fight the spread of fake news and hate phenomena, the individuals posting these materials need to be located in real time. Social networks must not be allowed to hide behind the clause that they're protecting their clients' privacy. Companies must be obligated to provide information on data flows subject to privacy protection laws. Of course, it's pointless hoping that such a government body will instill cosmic justice in social networks. But it's fairly reasonable to presume that once it's been set up, things will get better for us than the current situation of no regulation at all. Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. Winston Churchill. As already noted, splitting supervisory responsibility among various bodies is another obstacle worth considering. If the big tech companies are the servants of two masters, we can reasonably presume that they'll quickly and easily find a way to wriggle themselves to an easy escape route from the two supervisory masters. Note how these companies quickly got the better of Trump in Twitter's game of arm wrestling over his tweets. Big tech also smashed the social network Parler in a single day when it threatened their prime status. But reality does require some splitting, since, for example, supervising social media during elections must be managed by an elections committee, whereas supervision in the field of national security would continue to be relevant security organizations. The most important point is that there's a vital need to define the relationship between the digital authority and its operational institutions to ensure that the authority's activities will be independent of the political echelon. Think of moves taken by Putin as an example. You may be horrified by the boldness of this proposal, but take 2 minutes to ponder the fact that the principle of split authorities was framed by Montesquieu some 270 years ago, and perhaps the time has come to refresh its principles relative to the current challenges. Technology in our service. Laws can be passed to moderate the discourse on websites, such as those suggested above, but when the reality is some 6,000 tweets per second on Twitter, it would be very hard to enforce it without designated technologies. Putin was mentioned in reference to DPI, Deep Packet Inspection, a technology which, integrated with AI, is the primary driver that can assist in moderating the fake news phenomenon. It would also enable the digital authority a more effective ability to track information traffic not being caught by social networks. When you're surfing or busy with whatever it is that has your attention, whether you're sending emails, watching YouTube, or writing a post, your computer doesn't send or receive the whole film, email, or image at once. Because if that happened, there'd be no time for other computers to get a word in edgewise. Computers constantly speak to each other across the internet. They send data, wait for its receipt to be confirmed, then receive data from other computers. To this end, computers chop the messages up and send them in short data packets. Every packet has a defined structure, which includes, among other things, a title that indicates the sending computer's identity, the target computer's identity, and the packet's content. The Russian DPI system, located between the sending computer and the target computer, can listen in and collect and analyze the packet's title and content, then decide what to do with it. In democratic countries, these systems are primarily used to locate viruses, malware, and failed attempts to harm commercial companies. On one hand, they serve to effectively manage communication, but on the other, they are an aggressive commercial tool which can be manipulated to hide apps from the user's eyes as part of commercial competition. For example, China is apparently making use of these systems to hide some 16% of posts on social networks, as well as to conceal forbidden words in chats, such as Tiananmen Square, Animal Farm, democracy, and, as noted earlier, Winnie the Pooh. So if someone writes, "Anyone feel like going to Tiananmen Square?" half the sentence will be hidden. What remains is, "Anyone feel like going?" A bit ridiculous, perhaps, but it shows this tool's immense power. If you open a window for fresh air, you have to expect some flies to blow in. Deng Xiaoping, former leader of China. Wanting to maintain stability, Chinese authorities aim to restrict hundreds of millions of Chinese internet users by formulating draconian rules that include the obligation of saving surfing history and every internet user's full identity, as well as rigid behavioral rules. Try writing a response on the Chinese search site Baidu.com. You can use Google Translate to write something creative in Chinese. You'll quickly find out that you can't respond without identifying yourself via a designated app. The responsibility for enforcing these digital rules was placed on the social networks, which, with no other choice, employ battalions of censors. Most of the information on how the Chinese authorities operate can be drawn from a study published in Science. The researchers conducted observations by creating fictitious accounts on numerous social networks in China and checked content censorship functions. Deciding to go for the big picture, the researchers also set up their own social network inside China. What they discovered was that criticism of the country, its leaders and policies is allowed, even if severe. However, posts that breach the official limits set by the government, demean its leadership, or call for collective action are prohibited, whether they are pro or anti-China. For example, a post published in 2014 claiming that China's one-child policy is a social problem which must be resolved eventuated in the user being permanently removed from the network where the post was published. Surprisingly, the researchers noted that Chinese leadership uses criticism of content on social networks as a tool towards improving the country's management and to determine which government officials are doing their work well or who should be replaced. In her 2018 book, Censored, Professor Margaret Roberts describes the Chinese digital strategy, which encompasses three actions. Firstly, information is published in a concentrated form, much like the way Russia operates. Secondly, painful but not fatal damage is carried out to sites which refuse to obey. For example, when Google refused to align with Chinese requirements in 2010, China simply instructed its internet suppliers to slow down Google's traffic rate by 75%. The search engine became nerve-wrackingly slow and people simply stopped using it. For 3 years, Google's sector of the Chinese market drop from 40% to 2%. Thirdly, the Chinese government allows citizens to bypass the rules a bit, understanding that fully blocking content doesn't achieve much more than partially blocking content, but the latter's advantage is in its much lower cost. Slowing down data traffic on sites that China views as problematic is definitely sufficient, because who has the patience to wait for hours until the real truth finally uploads onto the computer screen? The government does allow, for example, surfing private pirate networks, VPNs, operating off the government communications infrastructure. In this way, China is the winner when it comes to social power. It's learned to use the minimum in order to impact public behavior. America, surprisingly, hasn't dipped into that kitty yet. In 2013, Edward Snowden, who had worked in the NSA, National Security Agency, revealed that the government was tracking American citizens via the agency. Obama's government denied it all, of course, but the truth eventually came to light. Once the materials went public, it appeared that the American government had collected most of the data on its own citizens, including their search histories, email messages, chats, credit card transactions, lists of phone numbers, cell phone data, data from social networks, and from GPS devices. Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Amazon, Apple, and Microsoft were all important and inseparable components of this massive spying operation. Since then, the governments of France, Germany, England, and Canada have passed legislation to expand tracking of their citizens through the Intelligence Act. Western liberal values do not accept this level of control. No one wants to live under stringent audits, even if the objective is to prevent social polarization. Any auditing should be done sparingly. Yes, we can't refute China's level of success in that regard, but in the Western world, that's not an option, and rightfully so. America's NSA tracking program failed just 3 years after it began, and deeply embarrassed the government. It seems that some frameworks of action are simply not appropriate for democracies. So how can social polarization damage caused by social networks be reduced without damaging our values as an open, free society? The guidelines I outlined earlier may well be enough. The digital authority could be assisted by existing automated tools such as Botometer, which locates Twitter accounts operated by AI systems known as bots. But it's mistaken to think that the authority would need tight auditing over everything, as there's no need to monitor it all. A duo of mathematicians from Los Angeles University demonstrated this. They conducted a series of digital experiments simulating social networks and checked the degree of influence that opinion leaders and media outlets have on network users. Their findings showed that an increase or decrease of even a small number of media tools and opinion leaders causes significant change to the degree of impact on the population. In other words, the tools are available and the rules that need to be enforced aren't draconian. It's enough to provide a small amount of monitoring in order to meaningfully tip the scale. In 2019, Israeli media personality Linoy Bar Geffen submitted a claim for damages against Twitter for its refusal to remove an anonymous defamatory tweet. In his ruling, the judge stated that if Twitter did not remove the detrimental post, responsibility would fall on Twitter in equal measure as it did on the post's author. The judge further determined that the case would be heard in accordance with Israeli law, overruling Twitter's request to have the case heard in its location, Ireland or the USA. In the same year, at the memorial for former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, Benjamin Netanyahu announced that as long as social networks enable freedom of expression for those whose voices are silenced in centralized and institutionalized media, they contribute importantly to democracy. The phrase "as long as" indicates, I believe, that the operational authority in Israel is also uncomfortable with the current situation. Centralized financial powers, such as those held by social networks, however, get easily transmuted into political power, as we'll see in the next chapter, and that in turn is co-opted towards thwarting regulatory innovations.